everybody, it's Luke over at Galaxy Tech Review, and today I've got Guild Wars 2 by request on a laptop with a GTX 1070, the MSI GT62VR. Up in the left-hand corner, of course, you're going to see a GPU temperature, a frames per second, a CPU temperature and utilization, and of course, system RAM usage as well. Let's take a look. This game is notoriously difficult on laptops because of the CPU utilization. So you'll see that in major cities and meta events where you're going to be getting 40 to 50 frames per second, even on a GTX 1070 with moderate settings, just because of the way that the game itself is optimized. If we take a look at our settings here, it's 1080p, and I've got it on auto detect. It's a selection of medium and low on certain things. Anti-aliasing is still on, of course. Post-processing is on high. We can turn things on like high-res texture, character textures, and some other things there. And you can adjust these as well. I don't have a problem with getting 40 to 50 frames per second in Lion's Arch when I'm running around. I don't need 60 frames a second in town. I can certainly lower some of these settings, or even lower it to 720p, and obviously get 60 frames a second here, but I still want it to look good. This is a good looking game, and I think it deserves to look good while you're playing it. Now, I did a review a few months ago on the Acer with a 940MX, and of course I played that at 1080p, and I was getting 30 to 40 frames per second out in the open world. That's not the case here. You can see we're up in the 60s and the 70s sometimes in town, so it goes back and forth. But towns and meta events are going to be the problem for your frames per second. Now, if we go to the open world here, you're going to see things jump dramatically. And that is to be expected. So if you are a Guild Wars 2 player, you know that when you're out in the world and you're doing living stories and you're doing story missions and dungeon runs and raids and stuff like that, it's not going to be so bad. The meta events where you have hundreds of players and the in-towns settings are going to be where you're going to take your biggest frames per second hit. Now, as you can see here, I'm doing a little bit of just regular combat in the open world, and we're looking at 90 to 105, 110 frames per second. So as you can see, no problems there with a bunch of animations going on. I'm at 100, 110 frames per second here. So when you're playing, you're not going to have that issue at all with low frame rate. If I was to have G-Sync on and V-Sync on, I'd be locked in at a nice smooth 60 frames per second at these particular settings. So it does very, very well. I'm going to let you guys check out some of the gameplay. It's not going to go on for too long, about 10 minutes, and I'll check back at the end.
Strong. think twice before venturing this way again.
So there you go. That's Guild Wars 2 on a laptop with a GTX 1070 mobile. And if you have a laptop with a GTX 1070, this is the performance that you can expect out of this particular game. Now again, this game is a high CPU, and using a mobile CPU, you're going to have certain limitations here. As you can see, these are the current settings, some high, some low, some medium, all on 1080p. Obviously, vertical sync is off. You can turn best texture filtering on, and it really doesn't change the frame rate too much, so you can leave that on. Now, if we put this on best appearance, this is everything maxed out, all on high. You can see we're right at that 50 to 60 frames per second mark in the open world. And so you can do it if you want to. Even on the 1070, it's pretty taxing in the open world. Of course, that means if you go into any area like a town or a meta event, you're going to be looking at 30 frames per second, which is totally fine if you want to or are comfortable with playing at 30 frames per second. I can get even 60s, 70s frames per second, even with all the textures on, everything on high. So for me, normally I would leave it at auto detect, which is pretty much what I would leave this at for a default here. Auto detect seems to be pretty good. You can turn on ambient occlusion, high-res character textures, and still have a great looking game at 90 to 100 frames per second in the open world, and 50 to 60 frames or 45 to 55 frames per second in towns, and have a great experience. So that's what I choose to leave it on, is this auto detect feature here that they have built in, and it works out very, very well. GPU held in there great at 50, about 50 degrees. CPU about high 60s with 25% or so utilization, and system RAM using 7 gigs of that system RAM. This was Luke from Galaxy Tech Review. If you have any questions or comments, want to see any other games on a laptop with a GTX 1070, leave them in the comment section below. I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Remember to like, and if you haven't done so already, please subscribe because that always helps me out. And I'll check you guys out on the next video.